Chapter 2, Introduction to Business. Understanding Economics and How It Affects Business. Page 26. Learning Objectives. After you have read and studied this chapter, you should be able to explain basic economics, LO 2-1, explain what capitalism is and how free market works, LO 2-2, compare socialism and communism, LO 2-3, analyze the trend toward mixed economies, LO 2-4, describe the economic system of the United States, including the significance of key economic indicators, especially GDP, productivity, and the business cycle, LO 2-5. Contrast fiscal policy and monetary policy and explain how each affects the economy, LO 2-6, page 27. Getting to know Heather Baushi, Council of Economic Advisors. In the years following the 2008 financial crisis, the issue of income inequality became a hotly debated topic among major economic thinkers. While some experts believe that companies should be primarily concerned about the needs of their shareholders, economists like Heather Baushi feel that issues like inequality profoundly affect economic stability in America. Countries that have this deep inequality, like we do, are much more prone to financial crisis, said Baushi, in no small part because high wealth inequality leads to more debt, which just makes your economy more fragile. Baushi's interest in equality and labor markets started at an early age when her father got laid off from his job at Boeing. Her mother said the family would have to cut back on some after-school activities as a result, giving Baushi first-hand knowledge of how economic forces could impact her life. That was the moment that I realized that actually economics, whether or not my parents have a job, affects whether or not I get to do things that matter to me in my life, said Baushi. After earning her bachelor's degree from Hampshire College, she moved on to the New School for Social Research in New York, where she studied for her PhD in economics. Baushi's doctoral research gave her the expertise she needed to understand the wider societal issues that had fascinated her since she was a kid. What I got out of the program was a solid understanding of how the economy works and a solid set of analytical tools with which to predict and to understand the economy, said Baushi. It gave me the opportunity to take classes in political science and political theory, and even a little sociology, and I gained so much from the richness of that experience. This wide-ranging academic background informed her scholarly writing, where she advocated for increasing access to quality education, reducing poverty, and creating good jobs that provide livable wages. These principles form the basis of Washington Center for Equitable Growth and Research and grant awarding organization co-founded by Baushi in 2013. The center allowed her to explore a number of important economic questions. What is it that creates a strong middle class? What is the role of the private sector and individual firms? How do we get to full employment? But more importantly, how do we get to a place where the typical American family feels economically secure? Baushi delved into these issues in even greater depth in two books, 2016's Finding Time, The Economics of Work-Life Conflict, and 2019's Unbound, How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. Her expertise has also been sought after by politicians and world leaders, culminating in Baushi taking a seat on the Presidential Council of Economic Advisors, along with providing data analysis for the president to help him make solid economic decisions. Baushi also studies how climate change will affect market forces in the future. With a planet that is changing and is no longer stable, that affects how we think about the trajectory of our economy, said Baushi. We can no longer think about economic indicators as existing in a stable planetary environment. As you'll find out in this chapter, economics is all about the direct effect that economic systems can have on the wealth and well-being of countries throughout the world. You will learn about the strengths and weaknesses of different economic systems and what makes some countries rich and others poor. We will especially cover the free market system that the United States depends on and the challenges it could face in the future. By the end of this chapter, you should be well aware of the relationship of economics to business success. Sources: Andrea Shellal, White House economist. Baushi remains optimistic U.S. can avoid recession. Reuters.com, June 21st, 2022. Katie Lederer, a Gen X advisor to Biden, argues equality is good for growth. The New York Times, NewYorkTimes.com, August 28th, 2020. Heather Baushi, M.A. Economics, 96, and Ph.D. Economics, 98, merges economic theory with praxis to push for progressive change. The New School, newschool.edu, December 6, 2022, Heather Baushi, Washington Center for Equitable Growth, equitablegrowth.org, accessed February 2023. Page 28. The CEO of this company coined the term conscious capitalism to describe his philosophy that businesses should serve all stakeholders and operate ethically while they pursue profits. Name that company. Find the answer in the chapter. How economic conditions affect businesses. LO 2-1. Explain basic economics. Compared to say Mexico. The United States is a relatively wealthy country. Why? Why is South Korea comparatively wealthy while North Korea continues to suffer economically, with power outages still a part of daily life? Such questions are part of the subject of economics. In this chapter, we explore the various economic systems of the world and how they either promote or hinder business growth, the creation of wealth, and a higher quality of life for all. A major part of the United States business success is due to an economic and social climate that allows most businesses to operate freely. People are free to start a business anywhere, and just as free to fail and start again. That freedom motivates people to try until they succeed, because the rewards are often so great. Any change in the U.S. economic or political system has an influence on business success. For example, an increase or decrease in government regulations has an economic effect due to the costs of adhering to the regulations. Some experts believe that less regulation is better for businesses. Others believe more regulations are necessary. The optimal level of government regulation is a constant topic of debate. Global economics and global politics also have a major influence on businesses in the United States. For example, the revenue of major U.S. industrial companies such as Caterpillar depend heavily on the global market, especially China. In fact, approximately 57% of Caterpillar's revenue comes from the outside of the United States. Clearly, to understand business, you must also understand basic economics and politics. This is especially true of new college graduates looking for new jobs. The economic contrast shown here is remarkable. Business is booming in Seoul, South Korea, as shown in the photo on the right. But in North Korea, a communist country, people lack many of the amenities enjoyed in the South, as the picture on the left shows. What do you think accounts for the dramatic differences in the economies of these two neighboring countries? Page 29. What is economics? Economics is the study of how society chooses to employ resources to produce goods and services and distribute them for consumption among various competing groups and individuals. There are two major branches of economics. Macroeconomics looks at the operation of a nation's economy as a whole, the whole United States, and microeconomics looks at the behavior of people and organizations in markets for particular products or services. A question in macroeconomics might be, what should the United States do to lower its national debt? Macroeconomic topics in this chapter include gross domestic product, GDP, the unemployment rate, and price indexes. A question in microeconomics might be, why do people buy smaller cars when gas prices go up? Such questions seem easier to answer. Some economists define economics as the study of the allocation of scarce resources. They believe resources need to be carefully divided among people, usually by the government. However, there's no way to maintain peace and prosperity in the world by merely dividing the resources we have today among the existing nations. There aren't enough known resources to do that. Resource development is the study of how to increase resources, say, by getting oil and gas from shale and tar sands, and create conditions that will make better use of them, like recycling and conservation. Businesses can contribute to an economic system by inventing products that greatly increase available resources. For example, they can discover new energy sources, natural gas for autos, new ways of growing food, hydroponics, and new ways of creating needed goods and services such as nanotechnology, 3D printing, and 4D technology. Moving 3D with time as the fourth dimension, mariculture, or raising fish in pens out in the ocean could lead to more food for everyone and more employment. In fact, many believe that aquaculture is the only way we can stop the overfishing that is depleting the world's fish population. The secret to creating a wealthy economy. Imagine the world when rich landowners had most of the wealth and the majority of the people were peasants. The peasants had many children, and it may have seemed a natural conclusion that if things went on as usual, there would soon be too many people and not enough food and other resources. Economist Thomas Malthus made this argument in the late 1700s and early 1800s, leading the writer Thomas Carlyle to call economics dismissal. Luckily, Malthus's assumptions about overpopulation were overly dismissal. Luckily, Malthus's assumptions about overpopulation were overly dismissal, and such mass starvation never happened. The latest world statistics show population growing more slowly than expected. In fact, it is predicted that the population will stop growing at all by the end of the century. In some more developed countries, such as Japan, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the United States, population growth may be so slow that eventually there will be too many older people and too few young people to care for them. In the less developed world, India, South Africa, on the other hand, population is climbing steadily and may lead to greater poverty and more economic unrest. The Adapting to Change box discusses significant global population shifts that are expected over the next 25 years. Such studies about the effects of population growth on the economy are part of macroeconomics. new ways of producing goods and services, add resources to the economy, and create more employment. Fish farms, for instance, create both food and jobs. Can you think of other innovations that can help increase economic development? Some macroeconomists believe that a large population, especially an educated one, can be a valuable resource. You probably heard the saying, "Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime." You can add to that. Teach a person to start a fish farm, and they will be able to feed a village for a lifetime. The secret to economic development is contained in the last statement. Business owners provide jobs and economic growth for their employers. Business owners provide jobs and economic growth for their employees and communities, as well as for themselves. Page 30. Adapting to change. The rise and fall of world population. Census.gov/pop clock. At the end of 2022, the global population reached more than 8 billion people for the first time in human history. The United Nations, UN, reports that the planet will reach its next population milestone by the 2050s, when 10 billion people will call Earth home. This upcoming increase of more than 2 billion humans will have a major impact on resources and could lead to significant lifestyle changes in many countries. But while the world will have to grapple with the effects of population growth in the next few decades, it might not be much of an issue after that. Experts at the UN estimate that the global population will peak at 10.4 billion people by the end of the century. In previous forecasts, researchers predict that the world's population would continue growing without end. These days, though, declining birth rates across the globe suggest that the number of humans on the planet should stabilize by 2100. For instance, the global fertility rate fell from 3.2 births per female in 1990 to 2.3 in 2021. The UN predicts that number will fall to 2.1 by 2050, just above the rate needed to ensure that generations can be replaced without decline. Analysts claim that the increasingly urbanized world population is partly responsible for the drop in birth rates, with 56% of the globe now living in cities. People are more likely to have just a couple of kids rather than large families with 4 or 5 children. As a result, older people will likely make up a large portion of the population for years to come. This could potentially lead to future economic difficulties if there is a lack of young people to replace the aging workforce. The UN says that immigration could become very important to many countries as they look to attract new workers that can take the place of older generations. Sources: Urban Development, the World Bank, worldbank.org, October 6th, 2022. Somani Sengupta, The Population Question, The New York Times, newyorktimes.com, November 30th, 2022. Alisa Lukpat and Joanna Sugden, World Population Hits 8 Billion. UN says The Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com, November 15th, 2022. World Population Prospects, United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN.org, accessed February 2023. Wang Feng, The Alternative Optimistic Story of Population Decline, The New York Times, newyorktimes.com, January 30th, 2023. The challenge for macroeconomists. The challenge for macroeconomists is to determine what makes some countries relatively wealthy and other countries relatively poor, and then to implement policies and programs that lead to increased prosperity for everyone in all countries. One way to begin understanding this challenge is to consider the theories of Adam Smith. Adam Smith and the creation of wealth. Rather than believing fixed resources had to be divided among competing groups and individuals, Scottish economist Adam Smith envisioned creating more resources so that everyone could become wealthier. Smith's book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, often called simply The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. Smith believed freedom was vital to the survival of any economy, especially the freedom to own land or property and to keep the profits that result from working the land or running a business. He believed people will work long and hard if they have incentives for doing so. That is, if they know they'll be rewarded. As a result of those efforts, the economy will prosper, with plenty of food and all kinds of products available to everyone. Smith's ideas were later challenged by Malthus and others who believed economic conditions would only get worse. But Smith, not Malthus, is considered the father of modern economics. How businesses benefit the community. In addition, in Adam Smith's view, business people don't necessarily deliberately set out to help others. They work primarily for their own prosperity and growth. Yet, as people try to improve their own situation in life, Smith said, their efforts serve as an invisible hand that helps the economy grow and prosper through the production of needed goods, services, and ideas. Thus, the phrase invisible hand is used to describe the process that turns self-directed gain into social and economic benefits for all. Page 31. According to Adam Smith's theory, Business owners are motivated to work hard because they know they will earn and keep the rewards of their labor. When they prosper, as the owner of this restaurant has, they are able to add employees and grow, indirectly helping the community and the larger economy grow in the process. What might motivate you to start your own business? How do people working in their own self-interest produce goods, services, and wealth for others? The only way farmers can become wealthy is to sell some of their crops to others. To become even wealthier, they have to hire workers to produce more food. So the farmers' self-centered efforts to become wealthy lead to jobs for some and food for almost all. Think about that process for a minute, because it is critical to understanding economic growth in the United States and other free countries. The same principles apply to everything from clothing to houses to iPhones. Smith assumed that as people became wealthier, they would naturally reach out to help those who are less fortunate in the community. That has not always happened. In fact, today, the poverty rate in the United States remains high, and there is a great disparity between the amount of money the people who are wealthy have and the amount of money the people who are poor have. This inequality is the central concern of many political, religious, and social leaders today. Many business people are becoming more concerned about social issues and their obligation to return to society some of what they've earned. The Giving Pledge, a philanthropic initiative started by billionaires Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, encouraged the world's wealthiest individuals and families to donate the majority of their wealth to support causes related to poverty, health issues, and education. Still, the economic question remains: what can and should we do about poverty and unemployment in the United States and around the world? As we mentioned in Chapter 1, it is important for businesses to be ethical as well as generous. Unethical practices undermine the whole economic system. Test prep. What is the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics? What is better for an economy than teaching a person to fish? What does Adam Smith's term invisible hand mean? How does the invisible hand create wealth for a country? Page 32. Understanding Free Market Capitalism. LO 2-2. Explain what capitalism is and how free markets work. Basing their ideas on free market principles, such as those of Adam Smith, business people in the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, and other countries began to create more wealth than ever before. They hired others to work on their farms and in their factories, and their nations began to prosper as a result. Business people soon became the wealthiest people in society. However, great disparities in wealth remained or even increased. Many business people owned large homes and fancy carriages, while most workers lived in humble surroundings. Nonetheless, there was always the promise of better times. One way to gain wealth was to start a successful business of your own. Of course, it wasn't that easy. It never has been. Then and now, you have to accumulate some money to buy or start a business, and you have to work long hours to make it grow. But the opportunities are there. The economic system that has led to wealth creation in much of the world is known as capitalism. Under capitalism, all or most of the factors of production and distribution, such as land, factories, railroads, and stores, are owned by individuals. They are operated for profit, and business people, not government officials, decide what to produce and how much, what to charge, and how much to pay workers. They also decide whether to produce goods in their own countries or have them made in other countries. No country is purely capitalist. However, often the government gets involved in issues such as determining minimum wages, setting farm prices, and lending money to some failing businesses, as it does in the United States. But capitalism is the foundation of the U.S. economic system and of the economies of England, Australia, Canada, and most other more developed nations. Capitalism, like all economic systems, has its faults. For example, income inequality is a major issue that concerns many today. Some business leaders believe that capitalism can be improved to better serve all stakeholders, including employees, communities, and the environment, not just CEOs and stockholders. John Mackay, CEO of Whole Foods, coined the term conscious capitalism to describe his philosophy that businesses should operate ethically while they pursue profits. This means they should serve all involved stakeholders, not just shareholders. Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce, concurs and uses the term compassionate capitalism. Some countries have noticed the advantages of capitalism and have instituted what has become known as state capitalism. State capitalism is a combination of freer markets and some government control. China, for example, has had rapid growth as a result of state capitalism. That is, freer markets and less government control, even though the country is controlled by the Communist Party. Under free market capitalism, people have 4 basic rights. 1. The right to own private property. This is the most fundamental of all rights under capitalism. Private ownership means that individuals can buy, sell, and use land, buildings, machinery, inventions, and other forms of property. They can also pass on property to their children. Would farmers work as hard if they didn't own the land and couldn't keep the profits from what they earned? 2. The right to own a business and keep all that business's profits. Recall from Chapter 1 that profits equal revenues minus expenses, salaries, materials, taxes. Profits act as important incentives for business owners. 3. The right to freedom of competition within certain guidelines established by the government. Individuals are free to compete with other individuals or businesses in selling and promoting goods and services. 4. The right to freedom of choice. People are free to choose where they want to work and what career they want to follow. Other choices people are free to make include where to live and what to buy or sell. Page 33. After years of planning and saving, Jessica Douglas, on the left, purchased a building with plenty of room to grow and started a business called Flowers and Weeds. The right to own private property and the right to own a business and keep its profits are two of the fundamental rights that exist in the economic system called free market capitalism. Would either of these rights be viable without the other? One benefit of the four basic rights of capitalism is that people are willing to take more risks than they might otherwise. President Franklin Roosevelt believed four additional freedoms were essential to economic success: freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship in your own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Do you see the benefits of these additional freedoms? Now, let's explore how the free market works. What role do consumers play in the process? How do businesses learn what consumers need and want? These questions and more are answered next. How free markets work. A free market is one in which decisions about what and how much to produce are made by the market, by buyers and sellers, negotiating prices for goods and services. You and I and other consumers send signals to tell producers what to make, how many, and what color, and so on. We do that by choosing to buy or not to buy certain products and services. For example, if all of us decide we wanted t-shirts supporting our favorite baseball team, the clothing industry would respond in certain ways. Manufacturers and retailers would increase the price of those t-shirts because they know people are willing to pay more for the shirts they want. They would also realize they could make more money by making more of those shirts. Thus, they have an incentive to pay workers to start earlier and end later. Further, the number of companies making t-shirts would increase. How many t-shirts they make depends on how many we request or buy in the stores or online. Prices and quantities will continue to change as the number of t-shirts we buy changes. The same process occurs with other products. The price tells producers how much to produce. If something is wanted but isn't available, the price tends to go up until someone begins making more of that product. Sell the ones already on hand. or makes a substitute. As a consequence, there is rarely a long-term shortage of goods in the United States. How prices are determined. In a free market, prices are not determined by sellers. They are determined by buyers and sellers negotiating in the marketplace. For example, a seller may want to receive $50 for a t-shirt, but the quantity buyers demand at that high price may be quite low. If the seller lowers the price, the quantity demanded is likely to increase. How is a price determined that is acceptable to both buyers and sellers? The answer is found in the microeconomic concepts of supply and demand. We shall explore both next. Page 34. The economic concept of demand measures the quantities of goods and services that people are willing to buy at a given price. All else equal, the lower the price, the higher the demand will be. Do you think there would be this many customers rushing to shop on Black Friday if it wasn't for those low price and low quantity deals? The economic concept of supply. Supply refers to the quantities of products manufacturers or owners are willing to sell at different prices at a specific time. Generally speaking, the amount supplied will increase as the price increases because sellers can make more money with a higher price. Economists show this relationship between quantity supplied and price on a graph. Figure 2.1 shows a simple supply curve for t-shirts. The price of the t-shirts in dollars is shown vertically on the left of the graph. The quantity of shirts sellers are willing to supply is shown horizontally at the bottom of the graph. The various points on the curve indicate how many t-shirt sellers would provide at different prices. For example, at a price of $5 a shirt vendor would provide only 5 shirts. But at $50, a shirt vendor would supply 50 shirts. The supply curve indicates the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. All things being equal, the higher the price, the more the vendor will be willing to supply. Figure 2.1. The supply curve at various prices. The supply curve rises from left to right. Think it through. The higher the price of t-shirts goes the vertical axis, the more the sellers will be willing to supply. The economic concept of demand. Demand refers to the quantity of products that people are willing to buy at different prices at a specific time. Generally speaking, the quantity demanded will increase as the price decreases. Again, we can show the relationship between price and quantity demanded in a graph. Figure 2.2 shows a simple demand curve for t-shirts. The various points on the graph indicate the quantity demanded at various prices. For example, at $45, buyers demand just 5 shirts. But at $5, the quantity demanded would increase to 35 shirts. All things being equal, the lower the price, the more buyers are willing to buy. Figure 2.2. The demand curve at various prices. This is a simple demand curve showing the quantity of t-shirts demanded at different prices. The demand curve falls from left to right. It is easy to understand why. The lower the price of t-shirts, the higher the quantity demanded. The equilibrium point or market price. You might realize from Figure 2.1 and Figure 2.2 that the key factor in determining the quantity supplied and demanded is price. If you were to lay the two graphs one on top of the other, the supply curve and the demand curve would cross where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal. Figure 2.3 illustrates that point. At a price of $15, the quantity of t-shirts demanded and the quantity supplied are equal, 25 shirts. That crossing point is known as the equilibrium point or equilibrium price. In the long run, that price will become the market price. Market price, then, is determined by supply and demand. It is the price toward which the market will trend. Page 35. Figure 2.3. The equilibrium point. The place where quantity demanded and quantity supplied meet is called the equilibrium point. When we put both the supply and demand curves on the same graph, we find that they intersect at a price where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. In the long run, the market price will tend toward the equilibrium point. Connect. I see it. Need help understanding supply and demand? Click on the video for a brief animated explanation.
It's fall, and Sean here is in the market for the right pair of jeans at the right price. His local department store has a ton of different styles, cuts, and brand names to choose from. In other words, there's plenty of supply, which is the number of products that businesses are willing to sell at different prices at a specific time. Sean loves the cut and fit of these jeans, but get a load of that price. The store wants $150, and on his budget, Sean isn't buying. In fact, only a handful of customers are willing to purchase the jeans at that premium price. So after a little while, the store marks them down 50%, and quantity demanded, which is the number of products consumers are willing to buy at different prices at a specific time, goes up. Suddenly, Sean and a lot of other consumers are ready to buy. When the quantity of jeans supplied at a specific price and the quantity of jeans demanded at a specific price meet, it's referred to as the equilibrium price. In a nutshell, that is supply and demand.
Proponents of a free market argue that because supply and demand interactions determine prices, there is no need for the government to set prices. If quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, the resulting surplus signals sellers to lower the price. If shortages develop because the quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded, it signals sellers to increase the price. Eventually, supply will again equal demand if nothing interferes with market forces. The making ethical decisions box raises an interesting question about when pricing may be a bit out of control and what to do about it. In countries without a free market, there is no mechanism to reveal to businesses via price what to produce and in what amounts. So there are often shortages, not enough products, or surpluses, too many products. In such countries, the government decides what to produce and in what quantity. But without price signals, it has no way of knowing what the proper quantities are. Furthermore, when the government interferes in otherwise free markets, such as when it subsidizes farm goods, surpluses and shortages may develop. Competition differs in free markets too. We shall explore that concept next. Competition within free markets. Economists generally agree there are 4 different degrees of competition. 1. Perfect competition. 2. Monopolistic competition. 3. Oligopoly. And 4. Monopoly. Perfect competition exists when there are many sellers in a market and none is large enough to dictate the price of a product. Sellers' products appear to be identical, such as agricultural products like apples, corn, and potatoes. However, there are no true examples of perfect competition. Today, government price supports and drastic reductions in the number of farms make it hard to argue that even farming represents perfect competition. Page 36. Making ethical decisions. Bad medicine for consumers. Your company, a large pharmaceutical firm, acquired a drug called Relivoform when it bought a generic drug maker. The purchased company was the market's leading supplier of the drug, and it was by far its most profitable product. Relivoform is a major chemotherapy drug important in the treatment of liver cancer. It costs $300 per treatment, and many patients rely on it to control the spread of their cancer. Currently, your company has many new drugs in development, costing the company millions in research and testing. It may be years before the Food and Drug Administration approves the new drugs and you can get them into the market. Your finance committee has recommended increasing the price of Reliviform to $3,000 per treatment to help alleviate the development costs of new drugs. Since your company now controls the distribution of the drug, even though it's a generic, you doubt any competitors could immediately impact your market. When word leaked out that Reliviform's price may increase tenfold, the public reacted with rage, accusing your firm of favoring profits over patients' needs. Will you follow your committee's recommendation and raise the price? What are your alternatives? What might be the consequence of each? Under monopolistic competition, a large number of sellers produce very similar products that buyers nevertheless perceive as different, such as hot dogs, sodas, laptop computers, and t-shirts. Product differentiation, the attempt to make buyers think similar products are different in some way, is a key to success. Think about what that means. Through advertising, branding, and packaging, sellers try to convince buyers that their products are different from competitors, though they may be very similar or even interchangeable. The fast food industry, with its pricing battles among hamburger offerings and the like, offers a good example of monopolistic competition. An oligopoly is a degree of competition in which just a few sellers dominate a market, as we see in tobacco, gasoline, automobiles, aluminum, and aircraft. One reason some industries remain in the hands of a few sellers is that the initial investment required to enter the business often is tremendous. Think, for example, of how much it would cost to start a new airplane manufacturing facility. In an oligopoly, products from different companies tend to be priced about the same. The reason is simple. Intense price competition would lower profits for everyone, since a price cut by one producer would most likely be matched by the others. As in monopolistic competition, product differentiation rather than price is usually the major factor in market success in an oligopoly. Note, for example, that most cereals are priced about the same, as are soft drinks. Thus, advertising is a major factor determining which of the few available brands consumers buy, because often it is advertising that creates the perceived differences. A monopoly occurs when one seller controls the total supply of a product or service and sets the price. In the United States, laws prohibit the creation of monopolies. Nonetheless, the U.S. legal system has permitted monopolies in the markets for public utilities that sell natural gas, water, and electric power. These companies' prices and profits are usually controlled by public service commissions to protect the interests of buyers. For example, the Florida Public Service Commission is the administering agency over the Florida Power and Light Utility Company. Legislation ended the monopoly status of utilities in some areas, letting consumers choose among different providers. The intention of such deregulation is to increase competition among utility companies and ultimately lower prices for consumers. Page 37. Benefits and limitations of free markets. One benefit of the free market is that it allows open competition among companies. Businesses must provide customers with high-quality products at fair prices with good service. If they don't, they lose customers to businesses that do. Do government services have the same incentives? The free market, with its competition and incentives, was a major factor in creating the wealth that more developed countries now enjoy. Free market capitalism provides opportunities for people who are economically disadvantaged to work their way out of poverty. Capitalism also encourages businesses to be more efficient so they can successfully compete on price and quality. Would you say that the United States is increasing or decreasing the emphasis on capitalism? Why? Yet, even as free market capitalism has brought prosperity to the United States and to much of the rest of the world, it has brought inequality as well. Business owners and managers usually make more money and have more wealth than people who work in non-management jobs. Yet people who are older, disabled, or sick may not be able to start and manage a business, and others may not have the talent or the drive. What should society do about such inequality? Unfortunately, one of the dangers of free markets is that some people let greed dictate how they act. Criminal and ethics charges brought against some big businesses in banking, accounting, telecommunications, and pharmaceuticals indicate the scope of the potential problem. Some business people have deceived the public about their products. Others have deceived stockholders about the value of their stock, all in order to increase executives' personal assets. Clearly, some government laws and regulations are necessary to protect businesses, stakeholders, and make sure people who cannot work get the basic care they need. To overcome some of capitalism's limitations, some countries have adopted an economic system called socialism. It too has its good and bad points. We explore these after you review the following test prep questions. Test prep. What are the 4 basic rights that people have under free market capitalism? How do business people know what to produce and in what quantity. How are prices determined? What are the 4 degrees of competition, and what are some examples of each? Understanding Socialism. LO 2-3. Compare socialism and communism. Socialism is an economic system based on the premise that some, if not most, basic businesses, e.g., steel mills, coal mines, and utilities, should be owned by the government so that profits can be more evenly distributed among the people. Entrepreneurs often own and run smaller businesses, and individuals are often taxed relatively steeply to pay for social programs. The top federal personnel income tax rate in the United States, for example, was 37% recently. But in some socialist countries, the top rate can be as much as 57%, whereas U.S. shoppers pay sales taxes ranging from over 10% in Chicago to 0 in Delaware. Some socialist countries charge a similar value-added tax of 15 to 20% or more. Bhutan's sales tax is a whopping 50%. Socialists acknowledge the major benefit of capitalism, wealth creation, but believe that wealth should be more evenly distributed than occurs in free market capitalism. They believe the government should carry out the distribution and be much more involved in protecting the environment and providing for people who are poor. Page 38. Socialism has been more successful in some countries than in others. This photo shows Denmark's clean and modern public transportation system. In Greece, overspending caused a debt crisis that forced the government to impose austerity measures that many Greeks oppose. What other factors might lead to slower growth in socialist countries? The benefits of socialism. The major goal of socialism is social equality. Ideally, it comes about because the government takes income from people who are wealthier in the form of taxes and redistributes it to people who are poor through various government programs. Free education through college, free healthcare, and free childcare are some of the benefits socialist governments, using the money from taxes, may provide to their people. Workers in socialist countries usually get longer vacations, work fewer hours per week, and have more employee benefits. Important example, generous sick leave than those in countries where free market capitalism prevails. The negative consequences of socialism. Socialism strives to create more equality than capitalism, but it takes away some of business people's incentives. For example, When socialist Francois Hollande became president of France, the top tax rate reached 75%, with many citizens paying over 75%. This caused many innovators, creative thinkers, doctors, lawyers, business owners, and others who earned a lot of money to leave France. This loss of the best and brightest people to other countries is called a brain drain. Imagine an experiment in socialism in your own class. Imagine that after the first exam, those with grades of 90 and above have to give some of their points to those who make 70 and below, so that everyone ends up with grades in the 80s. Would those who got 90s study as hard for the second exam? What about those who got 70s? Can you see why workers may not work as hard or as well if they all get the same benefits regardless of how hard they work? Socialism also tends to result in fewer inventions and less innovation, because those who come up with new ideas usually don't receive as much reward as they would in a capitalist system. Communism may be considered a more intensive version of socialism. We shall explore that system next. Understanding communism. Communism is an economic and political system in which the government makes almost all economic decisions and owns almost all the major factors of production. It intrudes further into the lives of people than socialism does. For example, some communist countries have not allowed their citizens to practice certain religions, change jobs, or move to the town of their choice. One problem with communism is that the government has no way of knowing what to produce because prices don't reflect supply and demand as they do in free markets. The government must guess what the people need. As a result, shortages of many items, include food and clothing, may develop. Another problem is the communism doesn't inspire business people to work hard because the incentives are not there. Communist countries such as North Korea and Cuba are suffering severe economic depression. People in North Korea suffer continued economic hardships, with food shortage common. In Cuba, people suffer a lack of goods and services readily available in most other countries. Therefore, communism is slowly disappearing as an economic form. Today, only China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba are communist countries. Page 39. Starting in the 1990s, Russia made the major change from communism toward a viable market economy. Still, there are few laws in place that help promote small businesses, and an active black market remains for many goods. This shadow economy grew even larger after hundreds of companies left Russia when it invaded Ukraine. Why are black markets bad for economic growth? The trend toward mixed economies. LO 2-4. Analyze the trend towards mixed economies. The nations of the world have largely been divided between those that followed the concepts of capitalism and those that adopted the concepts of communism or socialism. We can now further contrast the two major economic systems as follows. 1. Free market economies exist when the market largely determines what goods and services get produced, who gets them, and how the economy grows. Capitalism is the popular term for the economic system. 2. Command economies exist when the government largely decides what goods and services will be produced, who gets them, and how the economy will grow. Socialism and communism are variations on this economic system. Although all countries actually have some mix of the two systems, neither free market nor command economies have resulted in optimal economic conditions. Free market mechanisms don't respond enough to the needs of those who are poor, older, or disabled. Some people also believe that businesses and free market economies have not done enough to protect. Some people also believe that businesses and free market economies have not done enough to protect the environment. Over time, free market countries such as the United States have adopted many social and environmental programs such as Social Security, welfare, unemployment, compensation, and various Clean Air and Water Acts. Socialism and communism haven't always created enough jobs or wealth to keep economies growing fast enough. Thus, community governments are disappearing, and some socialist governments have been cutting back on social programs and lowering taxes on businesses and workers to generate more business growth and more revenue. Connect. I see it. Need help understanding basic economic systems? Click on the video for a brief animated explanation.
Meet Gabby, a recent college graduate looking for a customer service position in the telecommunications industry. In the capitalistic society where she lives, Gabby has the freedom to interview with any company she chooses and accept the job with the best pay and benefits. Gabby is motivated to work hard because the more profit the company earns, the greater her potential to earn more, maybe even enough to buy her own home someday. Of course, she has to give some of her income back to the government in the form of taxes. Her taxes help provide the roads and infrastructure that gets her to work in the morning, as well as other major services like Social Security. Now, if Gabby had the same job under a socialist system, she would work for the government, because major industries like telecommunications are government-owned. Competition is much more restricted, which results in a smaller choice of goods and services for its citizens. Gabby also pays a much higher tax to have access to social services. Now, if Gabby found herself living under a communist regime, she would probably not have a choice in her career. She'd go wherever the government needed her most. Instead of individuals and businesses controlling the marketplace, like under capitalism, the government is in charge of how goods and services are created and distributed, resulting in limited competition, high prices, and limited supply. In the real world, most countries operate within mixed economies, meaning they take elements from more than one economic system. For example, the United States is mostly capitalist, but the government operates some industries and regulates others.
The trend, then, has been for mostly capitalist countries, like the United States, to move toward socialism. Important example, more government involvement in healthcare, and for some socialist countries to move toward capitalism. More private businesses, lower taxes. All countries, therefore, have some mix of the two systems. Thus, the long-term global trend is toward a blend of capitalism and socialism. The net effect is the emergence throughout the world of mixed economies. Mixed economies exist where some allocation of resources is made by the market and some by the government. Most countries don't have a name for such a system. If free market mechanisms allocate most resources, the leaders call their system capitalism. If the government allocates most resources, the leaders call it socialism. Figure 2.4 compares the various economic systems. Page 40. Figure 2.4. Comparisons of key economic systems. Capitalism, socialism, communism, mixed economy. Capitalism, United States. Private ownership of land and business, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, free trade, emphasis on freedom and the profit motive for economic growth. Social and economic goals. Socialism, Sweden. Public ownership of major businesses, some private ownership of smaller businesses and shops. Government control of education, healthcare, utilities, mining, transportation, and media. Very high taxation, emphasis on equality. Social and economic goals. Communism, North Korea. Public ownership of all businesses. Government-run education and healthcare. Emphasis on equality. Many limitations on freedom, including freedom to own businesses and to assemble to protest government actions. Mixed economy, Germany. Private ownership of land and business with government regulation. Government control of some institutions. Important example, mail. High taxation for defense and the common welfare. Emphasis on a balance between freedom and equality. social and economic goals. Motivation of workers. Capitalism, United States. Much incentive to work efficiently and hard because profits are retained by owners. Workers are rewarded for high productivity. Socialism, Sweden. Capitalist incentives exist in private businesses. Government control of wages and public institutions limit incentives. Motivation of workers. Communism, North Korea. Very little incentive to work hard or to produce quality goods or services. Motivation of workers. Mixed economy. Incentives are similar to capitalism, except in government-owned enterprises, which may have fewer incentives. Motivation of workers. Control over markets. Capitalism, United States. Complete freedom of trade within and among nations. Some government control of markets. Control over markets. Socialism, Sweden. Some markets are controlled by the government and some are free. Trade restrictions. Trade restrictions among nations vary and include some free trade agreements. Control over markets. Communism, North Korea. Total government control over markets except for illegal transactions. Control over markets. Mixed economy, Germany. Some government control of trade within and among nations. Trade protectionism. Control over markets. Capitalism, United States. Choices in the market. A wide variety of goods and services are available. Almost no scarcity or oversupply exists for long because supply and demand control the market. Choices in the market. Socialism, Sweden. Variety in the marketplace varies considerably from country to country. Choice is directly related to government involvement. In markets. Choices in the market. Communism, North Korea. Very little choice among competing goods. Choices in the market. Mixed economy, Germany. Similar to capitalism, but scarcity and oversupply may be caused by government involvement in the market. Important example, subsidies for farms. Social freedoms. Capitalism in the United States. Freedom of speech, press assembly, religion, job choice, movement, and elections. Socialism in Sweden. Social freedoms. Similar to mixed economy, governments may restrict job choice, movement among countries, and who may attend upper level schools. Important example, college. Communism, North Korea. Very limited freedom to protest the government, practice religion, or change houses or jobs. Communism, North Korea. Very limited freedom to protest the government, practice religion, or change houses or jobs. Mixed economy. Social freedoms. Some restrictions on freedoms of assembly and speech. Separation of church and state may limit religious practices in schools. The United States is a mixed economy based on a foundation of capitalism. Like most other nations of the world, the United States has a mixed economy. The U.S. government is the largest employer. The U.S. government is the largest employer in the country, which means there are more workers in the public sector, government, than in any of the major businesses, like Walmart and General Electric, for example, in the United States. Do you think the government will continue to grow or decline in the coming years? Page 41, Test Prep. What led to the emergence of socialism? What are the benefits and drawbacks of socialism? What countries still practice communism? What are the characteristics of a mixed economy? Understanding the U.S. economic system. LO 2-5. Describe the economic system of the United States, including the significance of key economic indicators, especially GDP, productivity, and the business cycle. The following sections will introduce the terms and concepts that you, as an informed student and citizen, will need to understand in order to grasp the issues facing government and business leaders in the United States. Key economic indicators. 3 major indicators of economic conditions are: 1. The gross domestic product, GDP. 2. The unemployment rate. And 3. Price indexes. Another important economic indicator is the increase or decrease in productivity. When you read business literature, you'll see that these terms used again and again. When you read business literature, you'll see these terms used again and again. Let's explore what they mean. Gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, GDP, which we mentioned briefly in Chapter 1, is the total value of final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Both domestic and foreign-owned companies can produce the goods and services included in GDP, as long as the companies are located within the country's boundaries. For example, production values from Japanese automaker Honda's factory in Ohio are included in U.S. GDP. Revenue generated by Ford's factory in Mexico is included in Mexico's GDP, even though Ford is a U.S. company. Almost every discussion about a nation's economy is based on GDP. If growth in GDP slows or declines, businesses may feel many negative effects. A major influence on the growth of GDP is the productivity of the workforce. That is, how much output workers create with a given amount of input. GDP can also be affected by the fortunes of major U.S. firms. For example, when Boeing was forced to stop production of the 737 MAX, the cost to the company, as well as many of its suppliers, was severely impacted. Airlines such as Southwest also suffered revenue losses due to the grounding of the aircraft. Such losses have a negative effect on GDP. The level of U.S. economic activity is actually larger than the GDP figures show, because those figures don't take into account illicit activities in the underground economy, such as sales of illegal drugs, off-the-books transactions, and unauthorized gambling. The high GDP in the United States is what enables its citizens to enjoy a high standard of living. Although the country relies on GDP data, the accuracy of the data, at least in the short run, is questionable. Starting in the spring of 2014, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Commerce Department has reported a statistic called Gross Output, GO. Gross Output, GO, is a measure of total sales volume at all stages of production. Gross Output, GO, is almost twice the size of GDP and is considered a better indicator of the business cycle and more consistent with economic growth theory. It shows that consumer spending is the effect, not the cause, of prosperity. Page 42. The unemployment rate. The unemployment rate refers to the percentage of civilians at least 16 years old who are unemployed and tried to find a job within the prior 4 weeks. The unemployment rate was over 7% in 2013 and was down to 3.4% in January 2023. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a dramatic rise in unemployment to 14.7% in mid-2020. See Figure 2.5. Most economists consider a rate of 4 or 5% to be functionally full employment. However, many argue that the standard unemployment statistics don't accurately measure the pain being felt by those who have been unemployed for a long time, or those who have simply given up looking for a job. For this reason, they believe the real unemployment rate gives a more accurate picture of unemployment. The real unemployment rate is comprised of those included in the standard unemployment rate, plus those who are underemployed, discouraged, and marginally attached, those who have looked for a job within the last year, approximately. The real unemployment rate is typically double the standard rate. Some believe that government benefits, important example, unemployment benefits, may lead to more unemployment. Do you agree? Figure 2.5. U.S. unemployment rate 1989 to 2023. Figure 2.6 describes the 4 types of unemployment: frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal. The United States tries to protect those who are unemployed because of recessions. Defined later in the chapter, industry shifts and other cyclical factors. Which type of unemployment seems to be the most serious to the economy? Figure 2.6, 4 types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment refers to those people who have quit work because they didn't like the job, the boss, or the working conditions, and who haven't yet found a new job. It also refers to those people who are entering the labor force for the first time, like new graduates, for example, or are returning to the labor force after significant time away, like people who reared children, for example. There will always be some frictional unemployment because it takes some time to find a first job or a new job. Structural unemployment. Structural unemployment refers to unemployment caused by the restructuring of firms or by a mismatch between the skills or location of job seekers and the requirement or location of available jobs, like coal miners in an area where mines have been closed, for example. Cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment occurs because of recession or a similar downturn in the business cycle. The ups and downs of business growth and decline over time. This type of unemployment is the most serious. Seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment occurs where demand for labor varies over the year, as with the harvesting of crops. Inflation and price indexes. Price indexes help gauge the health of the economy by measuring the levels of inflation, disinflation, deflation, and stagflation. Inflation is a general rise in the prices of goods and services over time. The official definition is a persistent increase in the level of consumer prices or a persistent decline in the purchasing power of money caused by an increase in available currency and credit beyond the proportion of goods and services. Thus, it is also described as too many dollars chasing too few goods. Go back and review the laws of supply and demand to see how that works. Supply chain disruption and the surge in global shipping costs contributed to inflation during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Rapid inflation is scary if the prices of goods and services go up by just 7% a year. They will double in about 10 years. The Reaching Beyond Our Borders box highlights several examples of inflation out of control, way out of control. Disinflation occurs when price increases are slowing. The inflation rate is declining. That was the situation in the United States throughout the 1990s. Deflation means that prices are declining. It occurs when countries produce so many goods that people cannot afford to buy them all. Too few dollars are chasing too many goods, while declining prices might sound good. It's an indication that economic conditions are deteriorating. Stagflation occurs when the economy is slowing but prices are going up anyhow. Page 43. Hyperinflation occurs when the price of goods and services rises by 50% a month, often because a country's government prints more money to pay for excess spending. That's what happened to Venezuela in 2018, when the annual inflation rate skyrocketed by 1.37 million% and left many people unable to buy everyday items. How would you react if prices for goods like food and toiletries doubled every 19 days? The Consumer Price Index, CPI, consists of monthly statistics that measure the pace of inflation or deflation. The government can compute the cost of goods and services, including housing, food, apparel, and medical care, to see whether or not they are going up or down. Today, however, the government is relying more on the measure of core inflation. That means the CPI minus food and energy costs. Since the cost of food and energy can have temporary price shocks, the inflation measures reported core inflation are actually lower than real costs The CPI is important to you because some wages and salaries, rents and leases, tax brackets, government benefits, and interest rates are based on that data. Page 44. Reaching beyond our borders. Passing on costs to customers with shrinkflation. In the years since the COVID-19 pandemic began, businesses around the world have had to contend with rising inflation that has increased costs on everything from food to fuel. Still, many companies are afraid to drive away customers by raising prices outright. Leading them to seek alternative solutions to bring down expenses. One of the most common cost-cutting measures is shrinkflation, where companies reduce the size of a product's packaging while keeping the same price. For example, nearly every toilet paper brand has downsized in recent years, reducing the number of sheets per roll without alerting consumers. By paying the same amount for a smaller product, customers receive less value for their money, often without even knowing it. After all, companies don't like to draw attention to shrinkflation, preferring instead to pass off reduced sizes with the same branding they've relied on for years. Businesses have also tried to offset costs by charging for services they once offered for free. At Harley-Davidson, for instance, dealerships now require that customers pay a surcharge for each motorcycle purchase, passing on rising material costs to consumers for as much as $1,500 per bike. Meanwhile, Walt Disney World stopped offering its guests free bus rides from the Orlando airport to its theme parks. Although the happiest place on earth did not raise ticket prices, it did add on a number of additional fees that have upset longtime fans. Of course, there's not much that consumers can do about shrinkflation, besides refusing to buy reduced-sized products. Federation regulators plan to investigate the effects of so-called junk fees, like overdraft fees from banks or baggage surcharges by airlines. But there is no legislation regulating shrinkflation just yet. In the meantime, consumers will likely continue to purchase ever-shrinking items without realizing it. There are sizes that people remember, like a half-gallon of ice cream, said Harvard Business School professor John Gorville. Once you break from iconic sizes, it's pretty easy to move from 13 ounces to 12 ounces. Sources: Annie Gasparo and Gabriel T. Rubin. The Hidden Ways Companies Raise Prices. The Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com, February 12, 2022. Joe Queenan, How Far Can Shrinkflation Go? The Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com, June 2nd, 2022. Claire Toeniscoter, Meet the Man on a Mission to Expose Sneaky Price Increases. The New York Times, nytimes.com, December 1st, 2022. Carrie McNair, Getting Less for the Same Price. Explore how the CPI measures shrinkflation and its impact on inflation. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov, February 2023. The Producer Price Index, PPI, measures the change in prices at the wholesale level. It tracks price changes in nearly all industries in the goods-producing sectors of the U.S. economy. Other indicators of the economy's condition include housing starts, retail sales, and changes in personal income. You can learn more about such indicators by reading business periodicals, listening to business broadcasts on radio and television, and exploring business sites online. Productivity in the United States. An increase in productivity means a worker can produce more goods and services than before in the same time period. Usually, thanks to machinery, technology, or other equipment, productivity in the United States has risen because computers and other technology have made production faster and easier. The higher productivity is, the lower the costs are of producing goods and services, and the lower prices can be. Therefore, business people are eager to increase productivity. Remember, however, that high productivity through computers and robots can lead to high unemployment. Until recently, automation affected primarily factory and clerical jobs. Today, with the rising use of artificial intelligence, even highly skilled white-collar workers will be vulnerable. Now that the U.S. economy is a service, page 45. Now that the U.S. economy is a service economy, productivity is an issue because service firms are so labor-intensive. Spurred by foreign competition, productivity in the manufacturing sector is rising rapidly. In the service sector, productivity is growing more slowly because service workers have fewer new technologies available than there are for factory workers. However, that may change if the use of artificial intelligence grows as predicted. It can be difficult to measure productivity in the service sector. New technology can improve the quality of services without necessarily increasing the number of people served. A doctor can make more accurate diagnosis with scans, for instance, but still can see only so many patients in a day. How can productivity measures capture improvements in the quality of service? Productivity in the service sector. One problem with the service industry is that an influx of machinery and technology may add to the quality of the service provided, but not to the output per worker. For example, you've probably noticed how many computers there are on college campuses. They add to the quality of education, but don't necessarily boost professors' productivity. The same is true of some equipment in hospitals, such as CAT scanners, PET scanners, and MRI scanners. They improve patient care, but don't necessarily increase the number of patients doctors can see. In other words, today's productivity measures in the service industry fail to capture. In other words, today's productivity measures in the service industry fail to capture the increase in quality created by new technology. Clearly, the United States and other countries need to develop new measures of productivity for the service economy that include quality as well as quantity of output. Despite growing productivity improvement, the economy is likely to go through a series of ups and downs, much as it has over the past several years. We'll explore that process next. The business cycle. Business cycles are the periodic rises and falls that occur in economies over time. Economists look at a number of business cycles, from seasonal cycles that occur within a year to cycles that occur every 48 to 60 hours. Economist Joseph Schumpeter identified the 4 phases of long-term business cycles as boom, recession, depression, recovery. 1. An economic boom is just what it sounds like. Business is booming. 2. Recession is 2 or more consecutive quarters of decline in the GDP. In a recession, prices fall, people purchase fewer products, and businesses fail. A recession brings high unemployment, increased business failures, and an overall drop in living standards. 3. A depression is a severe recession, usually accompanied by deflation. Business cycles rarely go through a depression phase. In fact, while there were many business cycles during the 20th century, there was only one severe depression, 1930s. A recovery occurs when the economy stabilizes and starts to grow. This eventually leads to an economic boom, starting the cycle all over again. One goal of economists is to predict such ups and downs. That is very difficult to do. Business cycles are identified according to facts. But we can explain those facts only by using theories. Therefore, we cannot predict with certainty. But one thing is certain. Over time, the economy will rise and fall as it has done lately. Since dramatic swings up and down in the economy cause all kinds of disruptions to businesses, the government tries to minimize such changes. It uses fiscal policy and monetary policy to try to keep the economy from slowing too much or growing too rapidly. Page 46, LO 2-6. Contrast fiscal policy and monetary policy and explain how each affects the economy. Stabilizing the economy through fiscal policy. Fiscal policy refers to the federal government's efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or government spending. When the government employs fiscal policy, it is following the basic economic theory of John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian economic theory. Keynesian economic theory is the theory that a government policy of increasing spending and cutting taxes could stimulate the economy in a recession. The first fiscal policy tool is taxation. Theoretically, high tax rates tend to slow the economy because they draw money away from the private sector and put it into the government. High tax rates may discourage small businesses. High tax rates may discourage small business ownership because they decrease the profits businesses. High tax rates may discourage small business ownership because they decrease the profits businesses can earn and make the effort less rewarding. It follows, then, that low tax rates will theoretically give the economy a boost. When you count all fees, sales taxes, state taxes, and more, taxes on the highest earning U.S. citizens could exceed 50%. Is that figure too high or not high enough in your opinion? Why? The second fiscal policy tool is government spending on highways, social programs, education, infrastructure, like roads, bridges, and utilities, for example, defense, and so on. Such spending, however, can increase the national deficit. The national deficit is the amount of money the federal government spends beyond what it collects in taxes for a given fiscal year. The deficit was almost $600 billion in 2016. It ballooned to over $800 billion It ballooned to over $800 billion in 2018. And it was $1.4 trillion in 2022. Economists attribute this increased deficit to less money coming in due to recent tax cuts and more money going out due to retiring baby boomers and healthcare costs. Such deficits increase the national debt. The national debt is the sum of government deficits over time. The national debt is now more than $32 trillion. See Figure 2.7. If the government takes in more revenue than it spends, important example, tax revenues exceed expenditures, there's a national surplus that is not likely to happen soon. Figure 2.7, the national debt. One way to lessen deficits is to cut government spending. Many presidents and those in Congress have promised to make the government smaller. That is, to reduce government spending. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. Entitlements such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid take a large portion of the federal budget. And there always seems to be a need for new social programs each year. Thus, the deficits continue and add to the national debt. Some people believe that government spending helps the economy grow. Others believe that the money the government spends comes out of the pockets of consumers and business people, and thus slows growth. What do you think? Using monetary policy to keep the economy growing. Have you ever wondered what organization adds money to or subtracts money from the economy? The answer is the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed. The Fed is a semi-private organization that is not under the direct control of the government, but does have members appointed by the president. We will discuss the Fed in detail when we look at banking in Chapter 20. Now we simply introduce monetary policy and the role of the Fed in controlling the economy. Monetary policy is the management of the money supply and interest rates by the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed's most visible role is the raising and lowering of interest rates. When the economy is booming, the Fed tends to raise interest rates. This makes money more expensive to borrow. Businesses thus borrow less, and the economy slows as business people spend less money on everything they need to grow, including labor and machinery. The opposite is true when the Fed lowers interest rates. Businesses tend to borrow more, and the economy is expected to grow. Raising and lowering interest rates should help control the rapid ups and downs of the economy. The financial crisis begins in 2008, caused much anguish among Wall Street workers and people in general. How effective was the government's response? The Fed also controls the money supply. A simple explanation of this function is that the more money the Fed makes available to business people and others, the faster the economy is supposed to grow. To slow the economy and prevent inflation, the Fed lowers the money supply. Page 47. To sum up, there are two major tools for managing the economy of the United States: fiscal policy, using government taxes and spending, and monetary policy, the Fed's control over interest rates and the money supply. The goal is to keep the economy growing so that more people can rise up the economy ladder and enjoy a higher standard of living and quality of life. Test prep. Name the three economic indicators and describe how well the United States is doing based on each indicator. What's the difference between a recession and a depression? How does the government manage the economy using fiscal policy? What does the term monetary policy mean? What organization is responsible for monetary policy? Page 48. Summary. LO 2-1. Explain basic economics. What is economics? Economics is the study of how society chooses to employ resources to produce goods and services and distribute them for consumption among various competing groups and individuals. What are the two branches of economics? There are two major branches of economics. Macroeconomics studies the operation of a nation's economy as a whole, and microeconomics studies the behavior of people and organizations in particular markets. Like, for example, why people buy smaller cars when gas prices go up. How can we be assured of having enough resources? Resource development is the study of how to increase resources and create the conditions that will make better use of them. How does capitalism create a climate for economic growth? Under capitalism, business people don't often deliberately set out to help others. They work mostly for their own prosperity and growth. Yet, people's efforts to improve their own situation in life act like an invisible hand to help the economy grow and prosper through the production of needed goods, services, and ideas. LO 2-2. Explain what capitalism is and how free markets work. What is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system in which all or most of the means of production and distribution are privately owned and operated for profit. Who decides what to produce under capitalism? In capitalist countries, business people decide what to produce, how much to pay workers, and how much to charge for goods and services. They also decide whether to produce certain goods in their own countries, import those goods, or have them made in other countries. What is state capitalism? State capitalism is a combination of freer markets and some government control. What are the basic rights people have under capitalism? The four basic rights under capitalism are: 1, the right to own private property; 2, the right to own a business and to keep all of that business's profits after taxes; 3, the right to freedom of competition; and 4, the right to freedom of choice. President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt that other freedoms were also important: the right to freedom of speech and expression, the right to worship in your own way, and freedom from want and fear. How does the free market work? The free market is one in which buyers and sellers negotiating prices for goods and services influence the decision about what gets produced and in what quantities. Buyers' decisions in the marketplace tell sellers what to produce and in what quantity. When buyers demand more goods, the price goes up, signaling suppliers to produce more. The higher the price, the more goods and services suppliers are willing to produce. Price is the mechanism that allows free markets to work. LO 2-3. Compare socialism and communism. What is socialism? Socialism is an economic system based on the premise that some businesses should be owned by the government. What are the advantages and disadvantages of socialism? Socialism intends to create more Socialism intends to create more social equity. Workers in socialist countries usually receive more education, healthcare, and other benefits, and also work fewer hours with longer vacations. The major disadvantage of socialism is that because of high taxes, it lowers the incentive to start a business or to work hard. Socialist economies tend to have a higher unemployment rate and a slower growth rate than capitalist economies. How does socialism differ from communism? Under communism, the government owns almost all major production facilities and dictates what gets produced and by whom. Communism is also more restrictive when it comes to personal freedoms, such as religious freedoms. Page 49, LO 2-4. Analyze the trend toward mixed economies. What is a mixed economy? A mixed economy is part capitalist and part socialist. Some businesses are privately owned, but taxes tend to be high to distribute income more evenly among the population. What countries have mixed economies? The United States has a mixed economy, as do most other more developed countries. What are the benefits of mixed economies? A mixed economy has more of the benefits of wealth creation that free markets bring, plus the benefits of greater social equality and concern for the environment that socialism promises. LO 2-5. Describe the economic system of the United States, including the significance of key economic indicators, especially GDP, productivity, and the business cycle. What are the key economic indicators in the United States? Gross domestic product, GDP, is the total value of final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. The unemployment rate refers to the percentage of civilians at least 16 years old who are unemployed and tried to find a job within the most recent 4 weeks. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, measures changes in the prices of about 400 goods and services that consumers buy. What is gross output? Gross output, GO, is a measure of total sales volume at all stages of production. What are the four phases of business cycles? In an economic boom, businesses do well. A recession occurs when 2 or more quarters show declines in the GDP, prices fall, people purchase fewer products, and businesses fail. A depression is a severe recession. Recovery occurs when the economy stabilizes and starts to grow. LO 2-6. Contrast fiscal policy and monetary policy, and explain how each affects the economy. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy consists of government benefits. Fiscal policy consists of government efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or government spending. What is the importance of monetary policy to the economy? Monetary policy is the management of the money supply and interest rates. When unemployment gets too high, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed, may put more money into the economy and lower interest rates. That is supposed to provide a boost to the economy as businesses borrow and spend more money and hire more people. Page 50. Key terms. Brain drain, page 38. Business cycles, page 45. Capitalism, page 32. Command economies, page 39. Communism, page 38. Consumer Price Index, CPI, page 43. Core inflation, page 43. Deflation, page 42. Demand, page 34. Depression, page 45. Disinflation, page 42. Economics, page 29. Fiscal policy, page 46. Free market economies, page 39. Gross domestic product, GDP, page 41. Gross output, GO, page 41. Inflation, page 42. Invisible hand, page 31. Keynesian economic theory, page 46. Macroeconomics, page 29. Market price, page 35. Macroeconomics, page 29. Mixed economies, page 39. Monetary policy, page 46. Monopolistic competition, page 36. Monopoly, page 36. National debt, page 46. Oligopoly, page 36. Perfect competition, page 35. Producer Price Index, PPI, page 44. Recession, page 45. Resource Development, page 29. Socialism, page 37. Stagflation, page 43. State capitalism, page 32. Supply, page 34. Unemployment rate, page 42. Critical thinking. In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that cities could have school voucher programs that give money directly to parents who could then choose among competing schools, public or private. The idea was to create competition among schools. Like businesses, schools were expected to improve their services, how effectively they teach, to win students from competitors. The result would be improvement in all schools, private and public, to benefit many students. 1. Do you believe economic principles like competition apply in both private and public organizations? Be prepared to defend your answer. 2. Are there other public functions that might benefit from more competition, including competition from private firms? 3. Many people say that business people do not do enough for society. Some students choose to go into the public sector instead of business because they want to help others. However, business people say that they do more to help others than nonprofit groups do, because they provide jobs for people rather than giving them charity. Furthermore, they believe businesses create all the wealth that nonprofit groups distribute. A. How can you find some middle ground in this debate to show that both business people and those who work for nonprofit organizations contribute to society and need to work together more closely to help people? B. How could you use the concepts of Adam Smith to help illustrate your position? Putting principles to work. Purpose: to familiarize you with the sources of economic information that are important to business decision makers. Exercise: imagine that your boss asked you to help prepare the company's sales forecast for the coming 2 years. In the past, your boss felt that trends in the nation's GDP, U.S. manufacturing, and employment in Illinois were especially helpful in forecasting sales. Your boss would like you to do the following. 1. Go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis website, bea.gov. Page 51. 1. Go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis website, bea.gov, and locate the gross domestic product data. Compare the annual figure for the last 4 years. What do the figures indicate for the next couple of years? 2. Go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Website, www.bls.gov. Search for industries at a glance and click Browse Industries to find the information about the manufacturing industry. What is the employment trend in manufacturing over the last 4 years? 3. Return to the Bureau of Labor Statistics homepage, www.bls.gov, and use the search feature to find trends in employment for the state of Illinois. Look around the website to see what other information is available. Plot the trend in employment in Illinois over the last 4 years. Discuss what economic changes may have influenced that trend. 4. Based on the information you have gathered, write a brief summary of what may happen to company sales over the next couple of years. Developing career skills. Key: team, analytic, communication, and technology. 1. In teams, develop a list of the advantages of living in a capital society. Then develop lists headed, what are the disadvantages, and how could such disadvantages be minimized? Describe why a person who is poor in a socialist country might reject capitalism and prefer a socialist state. 2. Show your understanding team, communication, analytic. Two, show your understanding of what the principles of supply and demand. 2. Show your understanding of the principles of supply and demand by looking at the oil market today. Go online and search for a chart of oil prices for the last few years. Why does the price of oil fluctuate so greatly? What will happen as more and more people in China and India decide to buy automobiles? What would happen if most U.S. consumers decide to drive electric cars? Technology analytic. Three, this exercise will help you understand socialism from different perspectives. Form 3 groups. Each group should adopt a different role in a socialist economy. One group will be the business owners. Another group will be workers. And another will be government leaders. Within your group, discuss and list Discuss and list the advantages and disadvantages to you of lowering taxes on businesses. Then have each group choose a representative to go to the front of the class and debate the tax issue with the representatives from other groups. Draw a line and mark one end free market capitalism and the other end central planning. Mark where on the line in the United States is now. Explain why you marked the spot you chose. Students from other countries may want to do this exercise for their own countries and explain the differences to the class. Three was team, communication, and analytic. 4 was communication and analytic. Five, break into small groups. In your group, discuss how the following changes have affected people's purchasing behavior and attitudes toward the United States and its economy. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the increased amount spent on homeland security, the government involvement in banking and other industries, and the growth of the internet. Have a group member prepare a short summary for the class. Team, communication, and analytic. Career exploration. If you are interested in pursuing a major in economics, here are a few careers to consider after graduation. Find out about the tasks performed, skills needed, pay, and opportunity outlook in the fields in the Occupational Handbook OOH at bls.gov. Economist studies the production and distribution of resources, goods, and services by collecting and analyzing data, researching trends, and evaluating economic issues. Statistician applies mathematical or statistical theory and methods to collect, organize, interpret, and summarize numerical data to provide useful information. Marketing research analyst studies market conditions and helps companies understand what products people want, who will buy them, and at what price. Actuary analyzes the financial costs of risk and uncertainty and uses mathematics, statistics, and financial theory to assess the risk that an event will occur. Video case McGraw-Hill Connect, using fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Loading.
When politicians talk about the state of the economy, they are usually referring to which business cycle we are in: boom, recession, depression, or recovery. The economy is always in or heading toward one of these stages. The government prefers that the U.S. economy remains stable or, at the very least, changes slowly. One way they can help ensure that is by using fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has two main levers: taxation and government spending. Theoretically, by raising taxes, the economy slows because people have less money to spend. In a recession, when the economy needs a boost, government spending, such as stimulus checks or tax subsidies, increase consumer spending. Matt Frankel is a certified financial planner and contributor to The Ascent, a personal finance information service of the Motley Fool.
When it comes to taxation and government spending, it's not just as simple as it sounds. There are other ways governments can use taxation without actually raising taxes on everybody. There are a lot of tax breaks that disproportionately help wealthy Americans, for example, that they could close. There are other ways the government can stimulate the economy without spending money on a large scale. They can, for example, postpone student loan payments. They can also offer tax credits. So there are different ways that the government can use in those two categories to boost or cool off the economy.
An extreme and recent example of the government using fiscal policy to stabilize the economy is during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So when COVID first hit, the government really didn't know what was going on. We didn't have vaccines yet. We didn't really know how to treat the disease effectively. So they took this unprecedented step and paid people to stay at home.
On March 27, 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, which gave each family a stimulus check of $1,200 plus $500 per child.
There were a few other things that the government did to help keep the economy going during COVID. One example was the unemployment benefits boost. At the beginning of COVID, when people had to stay home, a lot of people were losing their jobs. The government gave $600 a week on top of whatever a state's unemployment benefits provided. In addition, for small businesses, there was the famous PPP, or Paycheck Protection Plan loan program, that provided forgivable loans for businesses that would keep their employees. There was also the EIDL program, the Economic Impact Disaster Loan Program, that provided additional loans for businesses.
In March of 2021, a year after the initial stimulus bill was passed, the American Rescue Plan was passed, offering another stimulus check to citizens, as well as various credits and loan payment postponements. Although the relief packages helped Americans stay afloat during the crisis, they also added tremendously to the government deficit.
If there's more money coming out of the government than there is coming in, then you have a deficit. If you have more money coming into the government than you have going out, you have a national surplus. When COVID hit, the national deficit soared. So when we have deficit spending, we need to borrow money to fund the government.
While the stimulus plans achieved their goal in stabilizing the economy during and right after the COVID pandemic, there were some unintended consequences.
E-commerce is one example. The government literally mailed people money, and they had to stay at home for months at a time. So what did they do? They sat at home and shopped online. You saw a lot of major e-commerce retailers grow tremendously during the pandemic at the expense of a lot of physical brick and mortar retailers. There's also the gig working trend. As people were laid off from their jobs, they gravitated toward on-demand work opportunities, and we're seeing that continue, and that's why a lot of physical businesses are having trouble finding staff.
Another unintended consequence of the pandemic was a shortage of goods due to a supply chain slowdown. Because we are a global economy, when factories in China were closed in early 2020, that affected what goods would be available to buy in the US in 2021 and even 2022. A shortage in goods, combined with the increase in spending from the federal stimulus, contributed to high inflation in 2022.
Fiscal policy, as in the government either spending money or increasing taxes, is just one tool in their toolkit to stimulate or cool off the economy as needed in order to respond to fluctuations in consumer spending, inflation, and all kinds of other pressures. Just remember that the goal is stability. The government will use its fiscal policy tools in order to make sure that the economy stays stable. That's its number one goal when it's figuring out how to use all of the tools in its toolkit.
When government leaders talk about the state of the economy, they are referring to the stage of the business cycle we are currently They are referring to the stage of the business cycle we are in currently. Boom, recession, depression, or recovery. The government strives to keep the economy stable or experience changes slowly with no big shocks. One way government tries to ensure economic stability is by using fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has two key elements: taxation and government spending. For example, by raising taxes, people have less money to spend, which slows down the economy. If the economy is in a recession, government spending, such as stimulus checks or tax subsidies, can help spark consumer spending, which speeds up the economy. An extreme example of the government's use of fiscal policy occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. When COVID hit in early 2020, the nation was at a standstill. We had no vaccines or treatment to manage the spread of COVID, and the government urged people to stay home. This situation raised serious threats to the stability of the economy, but the government realized this was the only alternative to battle the spread of the virus. To ease citizens' worries, Congress passed the CARES Act, which gave families a stimulus check of $1,200 plus $500 per child. The act also provided an additional $600 a week in unemployment benefits to workers, including freelance workers and other non-full-time workers. The stimulus checks were designed to keep people home and still be able to pay their bills. The program also allowed people to stop paying their mortgage payments for 6 months at government expense. Small to medium-sized businesses could pay employees through the Paycheck Protection Plan. All these programs were a part of the government's use of fiscal policy to help save the economy. A year after the initial stimulus, the pandemic was still not under control. Government responded again with Congress passing the American Rescue Plan, which offered another stimulus check to citizens, as well as other credits and loan postponement benefits. The relief packages clearly helped citizens stay afloat during the extraordinary times, but the expense of the programs added significantly to the government deficit. The government surplus or deficit is measured by the difference between tax revenue coming into the government and money going out through government spending each year. If more money is spent than comes in, a deficit occurs and the government needs to borrow money to cover its expenses, which increases the national debt. Today, the national debt is approximately $32 trillion. There's no question the COVID pandemic was unexpected and unprecedented. No one was certain what was going to happen and what would be the end result. One result was, as people stayed home and received a stimulus check, they shopped online, causing e-commerce to boom. The commerce companies could not find enough warehouse workers or delivery drivers. The gig economy also experienced major growth, with companies such as Instacart and TaskRabbit soaring. An unfortunate consequence of the pandemic was a severe shortage of goods due to slowdowns in supply chains. COVID was a worldwide pandemic when factories shut down in China and other markets. The effects were felt globally. It's safe to state that the U.S. economy, page 53, it's safe to state that the U.S. economy is always moving and fluctuating. Keeping it stable is a never-ending challenge. Fiscal policy is just one tool in the government's toolbox to try and keep the economy growing and stable. Thinking it over. 1. Was fiscal policy the proper action for the government to take in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Why or why not? 2. What alternatives does the government have to deal with increasing inflation that is impacting the economy? 3. Due to the supply chain problems caused by COVID-19, should the United States bring production facilities and other key operations back home? Notes. Page 54. 1. Andrei Lenkov, in the North Korean economy, the almighty US dollar still reigns supreme. NK News, nknews.org. February 7th, 2023. Sam Kim, North Korea's economy fails to rebound before fever surge. Bloomberg.com, July 26th, 2022. Moksh Suri and Abhishek Sharma, South Korea's economic security dilemma. The Diplomat, thediplomat.com, January 25th, 2023. 2. Mark Davis, government regulations. Do they help businesses? Investopedia, investopedia.com, March 17th, 2022. Paul Krugman, regulation, productivity, and the meaning of life. The New York Times, nytimes.com, February 7th, 2023. Wendy Adelberg, Richard G. Frank, Aaron Klein, Sanjay Patnaik, ETAL. Key economic policy developments in 2022 and what to expect in 2023. Brookings Institution, Brookings.edu. December 21st, 2022. Caterpillar. Caterpillar.com. Accessed February 2023. 4. Michael Boyles. Understand how politics can affect your business. Harvard Business Online. HBS.edu. July 19th, 2022. 5. Josh Boak. How ominous is the debt limit problem. AP News. APnews.com. January 19th, 2023. Romina Bosia and Dominic Lett. The debt limit and the high costs of debt. Cato Institute. Cato.org. February 1st, 2023. 6. What companies are fueling the progress in natural language processing? Forbes. Forbes.com. February 6th, 2023. Ankita Gangotra, Emanuela Delgado, and Joanna I. Lewis. 3D printing has untapped potential for climate mitigation in the cement sector. Communications engineering. Nature.com. 2023. Aquaculture. U.S. Foods and Drug Administration. FDA.com. Accessed February 2023. 7. Art Carden. Why is economics called the dismal science? Forbes. Forbes.com. November 20th, 2022. Jeffrey Rogers. Hummel. U.S. Slavery and Economic Thought. The Library of Economics and Liberty. ECONLIB.org. Accessed February 2023. 8. Could migration help ease the world's population challenges? NPR. NPR.org. January 30th, 2023. Michael Herman. The global population will soon reach 8 billion. Then what? United Nations. UN.org. July 11th, 2022. Max Rosser and Lucas Rodes Guaro. Future population growth. Our World in Data. OurWorldInData.org. Accessed February 2023. 9. Steve Lopez. Is our aging population a time bomb? An opportunity? Los Angeles Times. LATimes.com. January 12th, 2023. 10. CIA Fact Book. CIA.gov. Accessed January 2020. 11. Matthew Wills. Adam Smith, Revolutionary. JSTOR Daily. JSTOR.org. January 22nd, 2023. Daniel B. Klein and Eric W. Madsen. Adam Smith's Benevolence Puzzle. Bloomberg.com, January 16th, 2023. 12. Mehdi Alevi, The Truth About U.S. Democracy, Fair Observer, fairobserver.com, February 7th, 2023. Anshu Suripurapu, The U.S. Inequality Debate, Council on Foreign Relations, CFR.org, April 20th, 2022. Laura Singleton, U.S. Wealth Gap Widening More Quickly Than Europe's Science X, phys.org, January 25th, 2023. 13. Mitch Kokay, Government Numbers Skew Debate Over American Inequality, The Carolina Journal, carolinajournal.com, January 17th, 2023. Tackling Regional Inequality in the Rich World, The Economist, economist.com, January 19th, 2023. 14. The Giving Pledge, givingpledge.org, accessed February 2023. 15. David Prychitko, Marxism, econlib.org, accessed February 2023. Nick French, How Analytic Philosophers Have Made Sense of Capitalism, Jacobin.com, January 25th, 2023. Adam Tuz, Welcome to the World of Polycrisis, Financial Times, ft.com, October 28th, 2022. Patrick Darrington, Prophet of Discontent, looks at MLK's criticism of capitalism and militarism. Teen Vogue, teenvogue.com, January 16th, 2023. 16. Gabriella Boucher, Global Inequality is a Failure of Imagination, World Economic Forum, weforum.org, January 16th, 2023. 17. Will Kenton, Conscious Capitalism, Investopedia.com, September 28th, 2022. Conscious Capitalism, consciouscapitalism.org, accessed February 2023. 18. Peter S. Goodman, CEOs were heroes, at least according to them. The New York Times, nytimes.com, January 13th, 2022. Adrian Wooldridge, Mickey Mouse is corporate progressivism, canary in a coal mine. The Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com. Photo, Stockman. 3 things Americans should learn from excise China. The New York Times, NewYorkTimes.com. October 16th, 2022. State Capitalism. Council on Foreign Relations, CFR.org. Accessed February 2023. Ye Wen Lei, The Gilded Cage, Techno-State Capitalism in China, Initiative on U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, U.S.-China Dialogue.georgetown.edu, January 18th, 2023. 20. How to Fix Capitalism and Democracy. Literary Hub, lithub.com, February 6th, 2023. Atlas Chang Yulani, Capitalism, Ableism, and the Glamorization of Productivity. TheStrand.ca, February 7th, 2023. Soda Anderson, America's Inequality Problem in One Statistic, Coalition on Human Needs, CHN.org. Accessed February 2023. 21. Highest Taxed Countries 2023. World Population Review, worldpopulationreview.com. Accessed February 2023. 22. Janelle Fritz, State and Local Sales Tax Rates 2022. Tax Foundation, taxfoundation.org. February 3rd, 2022. Highest Taxed Countries 2023. World Population Review, worldpopulationreview.com. Accessed February 2023. 23. Sam Kim, North Korea's economy fails to rebound before fever surge. Bloomberg, Bloomberg.com. July 26, 2022. Robert Carlin and Rachel Min-young Lee. Understanding Kim Jong-un's economic policymaking. Foreign Trade Narrative, 38 North, 38north.org. February 6th, 2023. 24. Mark Frank and Nelson Acosta. Cuba. Forecasts only slight growth rises. Cuba forecast only slight growth rise as crisis grips island. Reuters. Reuters.com. December 12th, 2022. Mark Frank. Leak of secretive Cuban reserves data stirs confusion. Reuters. Reuters.com. January 17th, 2023. 25. U.S. Department of Labor. DOL.gov. Accessed February 2023. 26. Nikki Carvajal. Biden announces a Boeing and Air India deal for more than 200 jets. CNN. CNN.com. February 14th, 2023. Rupert Steiner. Boeing is cutting jobs. What it means for the economy. Barron's. Barron's.com. February 7th, 2023. 27. Will Kenton. Underground Economy. Investopedia. Investopedia.com. September 30th, 2022. Maria Feliz Arezzo, Serena Arima, and Giuseppina Quagnano, a two-part measurement error model to estimate participation in undeclared work and related earnings. Statistical modeling. Journals.sagepub.com. February 7th, 2023. 28. U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. Gross output by industry. Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Fred.stlouisfed.org. Accessed February 2023. 29. Labor force statistics from the Current Population Survey. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistic. BLS. .gov. Accessed February 2023. 30. Monthly unemployment rate in the United States from December 2021 to December 2022. Statista.com. Accessed February 2023. Effects of the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. BLS.gov. Accessed February 2023. 31. Kimberly Amadeo. What is the real unemployment rate? The Balance.com. December 2nd, 2022. 32. Donald Rapp. Bubbles, booms, and busts. The rise and fall of financial assets. New York. Springer, 2014. 33. Why is inflation so high right now? Entrepreneur. Entrepreneur.com. February 8th, 2023. The 2021 surge in global shipping costs was a canary in the coal mine for the persistent rise in inflation. International Monetary Fund, internationalmonetaryfund.org. January 24th, 2023. 34. Why is deflation bad for the economy? Investopedia, investopedia.com. June 2nd, 2022. 35. What is stagflation? What causes it? And why is it bad? Investopedia, investopedia.com. July 31st, 2022. Ijeoma Nwatu. What you need to know about stagflation. Aspen Institute, aspeninstitute.com. August 26, 2022. Paul Krugman, From Stagflation to Immaculate Disinflation. The New York Times, NYT.com. February 10th, 2023. 36. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov. Accessed February 2023. Kelly Ann Smith, The Consumer Price Index, CPI. Forbes, Forbes.com. January 12th, 2023. 37. Christina Majaski, Producer Price Index, PPI. Investopedia, investopedia.com. January 18th, 2023. 38. Alexandra Tansey and Reedy Pickert. Software robots are gaining ground in white-collar office world. Bloomberg, Bloomberg.com. September 29th, 2022. Annie Lowery, How ChatGPT Will Destabilize White-Collar Work. The Atlantic, theatlantic.com. January 20th, 2023. 39. Walter Block, What is the worst economic predictions in history? 39. Walter Block, What the worst economic predictions in history can teach us about economics. Fee Stories, fee.org. October 14th, 2022. Jose Federico Jelly and Afonso S. Mura. Getting into the nitty-gritty of fiscal multipliers. Small details, big impacts. The International Monetary Fund, IMF.org. February 2023. 40. John Authors. Whatever Keynes said, let's follow his advice. Bloomberg, Bloomberg.com. February 6th, 2023. 41. James Chen. Who was John Maynard Keynes, and what is Keynesian economics? Investopedia, investopedia.com. March 17th, 2022. John Maynard Caney's. Corporate Finance Institute. corporatefinanceinstitute.com. January 19th, 2023. 42. Jim Tankersley. How the U.S. government amassed $31 trillion in debt. The New York Times. NewYorkTimes.com. January 22nd, 2023. 43. Deficit versus debt. What's the difference? Peter G. Peterson Foundation. pgpf.org. June 29th, 2022. Kimberly Amadio, the U.S. national debt and how it affects you. The Balance, thebalance.com. January 17th, 2023. 44. Kimberly Amadio. What is the current U.S. federal budget deficit? The Balance, thebalancemoney.com. May 31st, 2022. Alan Rappaport and Jim Tankersley. U.S. deficit fell $1.4 trillion in 2022. The New York Times. NewYorkTimes.com. January 12th, 2023. 45. Christopher Condon. U.S. budget deficit hits $421 billion. Bloomberg.com. January 12th, 2023. What is the national deficit? U.S. Treasury fiscal data. Fiscaldata.treasury.gov. Accessed February 2023. 46. Jim Tankersley. How the U.S. government amassed $31 trillion in debt. The New York Times. NewYorkTimes.com. January 22nd, 2023. Troy Adkins. What the national debt means to you. Investopedia. Investopedia.com. November 7th, 2022. U.S. Debt Clock. usdebtclock.org. Accessed February 2023. Chapter 3. Doing Business in Global Markets. Page 55.